Now I have finally managed to get my hands on one of AMD's latest budget graphics cards, and in today's video I'm going to show you exactly what this thing can do. So AMD has always been well known for being able to provide the budget graphics cards to gamers, but recently things have gone a little bit skew because on the latest generations there isn't anything that's really budget priced, but the performance is actually fantastic. They've actually caught up with Nvidia on many different aspects, maybe not at the super high end, but in the mid ground they're kind of competing quite well. But today I wanted to take a look at one of their current budget offerings. This is the AMD Radeon RX 7600. We recently had a revisit of the RX 6600 and that was a card that extremely impressed me, and to be honest this one has really blown my mind. The exact model that we got here today is the Sapphire Pulse, and even for a base model it is extremely good quality. The card is built very well, there's no flex at all in this, and even though there is a plastic shroud on the top with a twin fan configuration which keeps this card super cool, the backplate is an aluminium plate and it looks extremely good in a case. We do have a slight pass through on the ventilation here, so some of that air can actually travel through the case up into what would be some kind of exhaust fans in the top of your case, so it does extract air extremely well. I was a little bit wary of getting one of these originally because of the red accents. I do find it quite difficult to kind of blend these kind of things into a build if a manufacturer does put a single color on it, but in fact it actually looks quite nice. It does only come with a single 8-pin connection, so most people's power supplies are going to be perfectly fine with this. And of course on the back here we do have 3 DP ports as well as 1 HDMI. That is more than enough connections for most people nowadays, particularly at buying it at this range, and these cards really do not cost that much. I'm actually really liking this model because it's not that heavy at all, there is no GPU sag, it looks very good in a case, and because of its nice compact size you're going to get away with it in most cases, to be honest, whether it's a micro ATX build or even some mini ITX builds. For the GPU, the RX 7600 uses the Navi 33. It has a base clock speed of 1720 MHz, a game clock speed of 2250 MHz. It has 2048 shaders, which is quite a jump up from the original RX 6600, as well as having 8 GB of GDDR6 memory. It is sitting on a 128-bit memory bus, but that's okay because for the memory interface it is a PCIe Gen 4x8. This card does use a little bit more power than the original RX 6600, coming in at 165 watt TDP, but it did have a much lower MSRP of only $269 at launch. That actually makes this card, compared to the original RX 6600, quite a good deal because originally at launch you would be getting a much higher spec card for a lot lower price, and of course it is running on the latest RDNA technology. I've been doing some benchmarking with this card and I've been putting it against our latest test suite, and that test suite does contain some of the most demanding games out at the moment, and I've been super impressed with its performance. This little card has managed to actually storm through all 3 resolutions that we've tested in a high preset, and I've been super impressed with the results, and I hope you guys are too, so let's go check them out. Now, as you can see from those benchmarks, the RX 7600 had absolutely no issue in 1080p. The only game here where we didn't manage to get a 60 FPS experience was of course Alan Wake 2, which was expected considering what type of game it is. But for the rest of them, we pretty much managed to nail 60 FPS on all the averages and nearly 60 FPS on the 1% lows. That was an absolute fantastic result, but the card is geared up to be a 1080p card. So we moved on to 1440p. Now in 1440p, the RX 7600 still performed exceptionally well here, managing to get pretty much an average FPS of 60 across most of the titles, excluding RoboCop Rogue City, where we only managed to get an average of 43 frames per second with a 1% low of 35. The game was still more than playable, but it wasn't perfect. And then of course Alan Wake 2, where we only managed to get an average of 35 frames per second with a 1% low of 24. That did mean that the game was kind of bordering playable and not. I know some people would say that anything above 30 frames per second is playable, but in this instance there was a little bit of stuttering here and there which really took away from the gameplay, even though the picture quality did look fantastic. 4K was really where this card started to fall over though, because we struggled to get 60 FPS on anything. The highest game here was of course Spider-Man Remastered, where we managed to get 50 frames per second on average with a 1% low of 42, but for the rest of them we were kind of bordering old school graphics cards here, with Alan Wake 2 only managing to get an average of 12 and RoboCop Rogue City only managing to get an average of 19. That means that the card isn't really geared up for 4K, but we wouldn't expect it to be anyway, not particularly at this price range. This card actually did so well at those native game presets that I wanted to see how much further we could push it, particularly by tuning some of those game settings. The card actually stormed 1080p perfectly fine, so there was no point continuing to test there. So what we did is we targeted 1440p to see what the maximum we could get out of it was if we just did a bit of fine tuning. Alan Wake 2 is a new game to our test suite for this graphics card, as I thought it would really put it to the test, and as I expected, it really did. In any native resolution with high settings, we could not get a 60 FPS experience from it, but with a bit of tuning, I think the RX 7600 did quite well. Running the game in a 1080p resolution with a high preset while enabling FSR2 with a quality setting, the RX 7600 managed to get an impressive 77 frames per second on average with a 1% low of 59. This is pretty much a 60 FPS experience now, and of course it requires FSR to save the day. But the game looked great and played smooth as well, just proving that even an entry-level card from AMD now can play some of the most demanding games out. Cyberpunk 2077 is an older game now, and over time it has had a lot of optimization improvements, and the RX 7600 really takes advantage of it. Jumping the resolution up to 1440p with a graphics preset of high, while enabling FSR 2.1 with a quality setting, it will net you an amazing average FPS of 85 with a 1% low of 67. For a graphics card that aims to be a 1080p card, this is actually quite impressive and really does show it moving itself up the scale. In Dead Island 2, you will get more than a playable experience in 1440p with the RX 7600, and it doesn't take a lot of tuning to get there. Running the game in 1440p with a high graphics preset while enabling FSR with a quality setting, you can get an average of 109 frames per second with a 1% low of 60. With these settings, the game looks amazing and it plays extremely smooth too. Hogwarts Legacy is another new title here where the RX 7600 can provide a great 1440p experience, and just like Dead Island 2, it doesn't actually take a lot of tuning to achieve it. Leaving the game in 1440p with a high preset and simply enabling FSR2 with a quality setting, it will net you an average of 100 frames per second with a 1% low of 70. Unlike other cards that I've tested, when enabling FSR in game, there is no hit to picture quality, the sharpness remains, and there is also no random stuttering when loading new areas. This quite surprised me, but also shows how far AMD's architecture is really coming along. Aside from Alan Wake 2, there was another game in our test suite which really does test all hardware, and that game is of course RoboCop Rogue City. It will play on older graphics cards like the RX 480, but you do usually have a hit to the quality quite a bit, but fortunately for the RX 7600, AMD's latest FSR3 with FrameGem comes to save the day. Running the game in 1440p with a medium preset while enabling FSR3 with a balance setting and turning on frame generation, it moves this card completely to a new tier, reaching an average of 106 frames per second with a 1% low of 51. This doesn't quite allow us to hit that 60 FPS mark for the 1% lows as we would have liked, but any further drop in configuration really hit the graphics quality, but at these settings the game is actually pretty smooth and is a great experience. The last game in our tune testing is of course Starfield, another title that was very demanding and something I would usually write off for an entry level card like this, but as with RoboCop Rogue City, Starfield has a little AMD magic in it. Running the game in 1440p with a high preset while enabling FSR3 and frame gen, it means the game is very playable, getting an average of 99 frames per second, and a 1% low of 78. The render resolution here was set to 100, so it wasn't actually really upscaling anything, and yet it still provided a fantastic performance and it looked amazing too. I think going forward with more games getting technologies like FSR and FrameGen, cards like the RX 7600 will become much more appealing to more people, as anything bigger for casual gamers just really won't be needed, and it really does show in our testing. Now of course the only game that this card really struggled with to get a decent performance in those higher resolutions was of course Alan Wake 2, which was totally to be expected, particularly for the price of the card itself. But for everything else it performed like a champ. I would actually say that this card is bordering a 1440p card, particularly for the games that are out at the moment, maybe not going forward, particularly with like Alan Wake struggling there. Modern games and new releases are going to kind of have very similar results, I would have thought. So AMD are probably right targeting this card at 1080p, but right now on the games that we kind of have more available, it is definitely more of a 1440p card. That is where the sweet spot of this is, once you tune those settings and turn on some of those fancy tools. The performance from this mini monster from AMD has actually surprised me straight out of the gate. I only expected around a 5 to 10% increase over the RX 6600, but I was greatly surprised that it is way faster than that. How much faster? Well, we recently did a revisit of the RX 6600 in many of those same titles, so it's given us a great opportunity to do a comparison. When it comes to the 1080p comparison testing here, the RX 7600 was around 41% faster on average across all 6 games that we compared. That is an absolute phenomenal difference here and really takes this card up to another tier. 1440p was a sweet spot again with this card, where we saw a 46% increase on average across all those 6 games again, which was phenomenal, again taking this card to the next tier, and it's probably why I'm kind of gearing it really towards that 1440p resolution. But then when it came to 4K, it actually started to drop behind here. The increase was only around 27% on average across all 6 games, but it still gave you enough boost to be able to actually get some of those games playable. And of course, for anything older where you will be able to get a 4K experience, it's going to make a hell of a difference. And we saw that difference while testing a different title. I actually decided to have a go at Doom Eternal just to see how far we could push this card, because that game is very well optimized and it generally plays very well on most hardware. And with a 4K high setting, we could manage to get an average of 95 frames per second with a 1% low of 70. But then when we actually decided to drop it down to 1440p, we could set the graphics preset to high and turn on ray tracing and still manage to achieve 80 frames per second on average with a 1% low of 65. Now that of course means that with the RX 7600 and a game like Doom Eternal, you're going to be able to get a decent 60 FPS experience whether you're in 4K high or in 1440p high with ray tracing turned on. So that is an absolutely fantastic achievement for AMD going forward. Now I can't wait to see where AMD take their graphics cards next, because they've been making some real achievements when it comes to performance in their 6000 and 7000 series cards. I do have an RX 7900 XT, which is a phenomenally fast card, but I didn't expect the kind of uplift when you get down to the bottom here, particularly with the price reductions that they had over the previous generation. But that brings us to the end of our look at the RX 7600. We've done a lot of testing on it and it has greatly surprised us. Let me know in the comments below what you guys think of the RX 7600. Is it a card that you would consider, or would you just say it's just too much for what it is? I think for budget gamers going forward, this is going to be a great option for them, particularly once the price comes down a little bit. I paid around £250 for this card, which is still around what the MSRP really was, but just like the RX 6600, I can imagine that they will drop quite rapidly, particularly when newer generations are kind of being geared up to be released. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you like this kind of content. I'm going to be testing another graphics card soon, one that should actually be a good comparison to this, but from a different brand. You won't want to miss that. And I'm sure as always, I'll catch you guys in the next one.